It was supposed to be a routine demonstration of military force. A battle-hardened commander wanted to show his recruits how easily a smaller man could be broken. He pointed to the quiet, slight civilian in the back row. He had no idea he was pointing at a sleeping dragon. The air inside the Camp Pendleton Gymnasium in August of 1967 was thick enough to chew. It smelled of canvas dust, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. On the center mats, bathed in the harsh glare of overhead fluorescent lights, stood Commander Richard Hayes. Hayes was a man carved from granite and bad intentions. Standing 6'3" and weighing a dense 220 pounds, he was a veteran of brutal trench skirmishes and a highly decorated close-quarters combat instructor. His face was a map of old scars, and his knuckles were permanently flattened from years of heavy bag work and bare-knuckle brawls. To the 60 young, terrified recruits sitting cross-legged on the floor around him, Hayes wasn't just an officer, he was an apex predator. Among the recruits, Private Thomas Sullivan nervously wiped sweat from his brow. Sullivan had just watched Hayes dismantle 3 different sparring partners in less than 10 minutes. The commander didn't just teach martial arts, he taught dominance. His philosophy was simple, brutal, and entirely reliant on overwhelming force. "Size matters," Hayes had bellowed earlier, his voice echoing off the cinder-block walls. "Mass multiplied by aggression equals survival." As Hayes paused to grab a towel, the heavy double doors at the back of the gymnasium creaked open. The sharp squeak of the hinges drew the eyes of the recruits, and eventually the annoyed glare of Commander Hayes. In walked Captain Arthur Fletcher, the base's liaison for external training programs. But it wasn't Fletcher who captured the room's attention. It was the man walking half a step behind him. He was a civilian, entirely out of place in the sea of olive drab and camouflage. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal track jacket, dark trousers, and traditional canvas shoes. He was slight, perhaps 5'7", weighing no more than 135 pounds soaking wet. He wore dark, aviator-style sunglasses, despite the indoor lighting, and his hands were casually tucked into his pockets. He moved with a strange, liquid grace, completely devoid of the rigid, heavy-footed stomp typical of military men. Hayes narrowed his eyes. He hated interruptions, and he possessed a particular disdain for civilians wandering into his domain. "Captain Fletcher," Hayes called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "We are in the middle of a live-fire grappling drill. Is there a reason you're giving a tour of my mat?" Fletcher cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Commander Hayes, apologies for the intrusion. We are just observing. My guest here is a consultant. We're touring the West Coast bases, evaluating different hand-to-hand combat curriculums." Hayes let out a sharp, derisive snort. He looked the civilian up and down, taking in the slim frame, the narrow shoulders, and the relaxed posture. To a man like Hayes, who judged danger by bicep circumference and height, the civilian looked like prey. "A consultant," Hayes echoed mockingly, stepping to the edge of the mat. He turned to his recruits. "Listen up, gentlemen. Today is your lucky day. It seems Washington has sent us an academic to see how real men fight." The recruits shifted nervously. Private Sullivan swallowed hard, recognizing the dangerous glint in the commander's eye. Hayes was looking for a way to reassert his absolute authority over the room, and he had just found his target. "Since you're evaluating," Hayes said, locking his gaze on the civilian, "why don't you come down here? Let's give you a first-hand look at the Pendleton curriculum." Captain Fletcher raised a hand, stepping in front of his guest. "Commander, that won't be necessary. Mr. Lee is just here to—" "I insist," Hayes interrupted, his voice dropping an octave into a low, rumbling threat. unless the consultant is afraid of stepping onto a military mat. I need a volunteer for my next demonstration anyway. A demonstration on how to handle an opponent who lacks the physical strength to defend himself." The insult was deliberate and heavy-handed. Fletcher opened his mouth to order Hayes to stand down, but before he could speak, a hand gently touched his shoulder. The civilian took off his sunglasses, folding them with deliberate slowness and slipping them into his breast pocket. His eyes were dark, piercing, and completely devoid of fear. In fact, there was a faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It is perfectly fine, Captain," the civilian said. His voice was calm, melodic, and possessed a quiet resonance that somehow carried across the massive gymnasium. "I would be honored to assist the commander." Fletcher looked at the young man, a bead of sweat rolling down the captain's temple. "Are you sure? He plays rough." "Water can flow," the man replied softly, stepping past the captain. "Or it can crash." As the small civilian walked down the bleacher stairs and approached the center mat, the physical contrast became almost comical. Hayes towered over him, casting a literal shadow over the smaller man. Private Sullivan leaned over to the recruit next to him, a boy named David Miller. "The commander is going to break him in half," Miller whispered, wincing in advance. "He shouldn't have walked down there," Sullivan agreed grimly. Hayes crossed his massive arms, looking down at the young Chinese-American man standing before him. The civilian stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. There was no aggressive posturing, no clenching of fists. He was entirely relaxed, yet exuded a strange, vibrating energy, like a coiled spring hidden beneath silk. "All right, son," Hayes said loudly, making sure the recruits could hear every patronizing word. "I'm going to demonstrate a standard wrist control to hip toss. It's designed to neutralize a weaker opponent who gets too close. I don't want you to do anything. Just stand there, and when I grab your lapel, try to pull away. I'll do the rest. I'll try not to drop you too hard." "I understand," the young man said simply. "Whenever you are ready." Hayes grinned, showing his teeth. He uncrossed his arms and stepped into his fighting stance. He had no intention of being gentle. He wanted the throw to echo through the building. He wanted the crack of the civilian's back against the canvas to be a lesson to every recruit in the room. This is my house. The lion had lured the lamb into his den. But what Commander Hayes failed to realize, as he reached out his massive, calloused hand to grab the young man's jacket, was that he wasn't looking at a lamb. The gymnasium was dead silent. 60 recruits held their breath, waiting for the inevitable sound of impact. Commander Hayes lunged forward, his massive right hand shooting out to grab the civilian's collar. His intention was to establish a dominant grip, anchor the smaller man's weight, and violently pivot his own hips to launch him through the air. It was a move Hayes had executed 1,000 times. But the moment Hayes's fingers closed around the fabric, something impossible happened. Instead of bracing against the pull, the small civilian seemed to evaporate. He didn't step backward. He shifted his weight with a microscopic pivot of his hips and a slight drop of his center of gravity. At the exact same fraction of a second, the civilian's left hand floated up and gently rested on Hayes's forearm. It didn't look like a strike. It looked like a casual touch. But to Hayes, it felt as though he had just grabbed onto a live high-voltage wire. The civilian rotated his body, perfectly redirecting Hayes's forward momentum. Hayes, expecting resistance to pull against, found only empty air. With a startled grunt, the 220-pound commander stumbled forward, completely off balance, his boots sliding awkwardly across the canvas. He had to take 3 rapid, stumbling steps just to keep from falling flat on his face, ending up with his back to the civilian. A collective gasp rippled through the seated recruits. Private Sullivan's jaw practically hit his chest. Commander Hayes, The immovable object of Camp Pendleton had just been tossed aside like a feather in a breeze, and the civilian hadn't even seemed to move. Hayes spun around, his face flushing violently crimson. The embarrassment was an immediate, scorching fire in his gut. He looked at his boots, quickly blaming the canvas. "Slippery spot on the mat," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. He glared at the young man who had calmly returned to his perfectly relaxed, hands by his sides stance. The faint smile was gone, replaced by an expression of serene, almost surgical focus. "You moved," Hayes growled, pointing a thick finger. "I told you to stand still and pull away." "You used force against emptiness, Commander," the young man replied, his tone conversational, as if explaining a mathematical equation. "When you pull, I yield. If you push, I will also yield. You must control your own center of gravity before you attempt to control mine." The academic explanation, delivered in front of his men, was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Hayes's vision narrowed. Protocol, safety, and the rules of a standard demonstration vanished from his mind. He was going to put this arrogant civilian in the hospital. "Forget the throw," Hayes hissed, stepping aggressively into the center of the mat, bringing his hands up into a heavy boxer's guard. "You think you're pretty fast, kid. Let's see how you yield to a real attack. Come on, throw a punch at me." Captain Fletcher immediately stepped forward from the sidelines. "Commander Hayes, stand down. This is a demonstration, not a sparring match." "Stay out of this, Fletcher," Hayes roared, not taking his eyes off the civilian. "The consultant wants to teach a lesson on gravity. Let's see his lesson. Throw a punch, kid. I'm giving you a free shot." The young man shook his head slowly. "I am not here to fight you, Commander. I am only here to observe." "You're a coward," Hayes sneered, closing the distance, his towering frame casting a dark shadow over the slight martial artist. "You got lucky on a slip, and now you're backing down in front of my men. If you don't throw a strike, I'm going to take your head off." "Commander, I strongly advise against this," the young man said. His voice was no longer melodic. It had dropped, turning flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the sound of a vault door clicking shut. Hayes didn't listen. Fueled by rage and humiliated pride, he shifted his weight and unleashed a devastating right cross aimed directly at the civilian's jaw. It was a punch that had knocked out heavyweight Marines, a brutal, snapping strike with all 220 pounds of Hayes's mass behind it. What happened next occurred so fast that Private Sullivan and the other recruits couldn't properly process the visual information. It had to be pieced together later in hushed whispers in the barracks. The young man didn't block the punch. He didn't retreat. Instead, he exploded forward. Slap, crack! The sounds were simultaneous. Before Hayes's heavy fist could travel halfway to its target, the civilian's lead hand shot out, striking Hayes's forearm, a park sow, deflecting the massive punch outward by a mere 3 inches. It was just enough to make the strike miss completely. In the exact same microscopic window of time, the civilian's right foot slid behind Hayes's lead leg, trapping his ankle. Hayes was now completely exposed, his momentum carrying him forward into a void, his lower body anchored in place. He looked down, his eyes widening in sudden, terrifying realization. The young man was already inside his guard. The civilian's right fist was positioned vertically, resting lightly against the very center of Hayes's massive chest. There was no wind-up, no drawing back of the arm. The fist was practically touching the commander's uniform. Thwack! It didn't look like a punch. It looked like a violent full-body spasm. The young man's hips snapped, driving kinetic energy through his torso, down his shoulder, and out through his knuckles in a devastating 1-inch shockwave. The sound of the impact was sickening, a deep, hollow drum beat that echoed into the rafters. Commander Hayes's eyes rolled back. His feet left the mat entirely. The sheer concussive force of the strike lifted the 220-pound giant off the ground and launched him backward. He flew through the air, traveling a full 5 feet before crashing violently onto his back. Wham! Hayes hit the canvas with bone-jarring force, sliding another foot before finally coming to a halt. He lay there, spread-eagled, his chest heaving as he desperately gasped for air that had been completely driven from his lungs. His arms twitched, but he could not sit up. The silence that fell over the gymnasium was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. 60 Marines sat frozen, their mouths open, staring in sheer disbelief at the fallen Titan on the floor. In the center of the mat, the young civilian had already returned to his relaxed stance. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his dark sunglasses, and calmly slid them back onto his face. Captain Fletcher exhaled a long, shaky breath, breaking the silence. He looked down at the gasping commander, then turned to the recruits, his voice trembling slightly. "Gentlemen," Fletcher announced to the stunned room, gesturing to the man in the sunglasses. "As I was trying to say, I'd like to introduce our guest consultant, Mr. Bruce Lee." The name hung in the stagnant air of the gymnasium, heavier than the summer humidity. Bruce Lee. To the recruits in 1967, the name meant little. The Green Hornet television show had recently aired, bringing a masked martial artist into American living rooms. But to these battle-bound Marines, television was a world away. What they understood was the reality lying on the canvas in front of them. Their indestructible instructor had been felled by a single, impossibly short strike. Major William Reynolds, the base medical officer who had been observing the drills from the bleachers, broke from his paralysis. He sprinted down the wooden steps, his boots clattering loudly, and slid onto the mat next to the fallen commander. "Don't move, Richard. Let me check your ribs," Reynolds instructed, reaching out to palpate Hayes's chest. Hayes let out a ragged, wheezing cough, violently swatting the doctor's hands away. The commander's face, previously flushed with anger, was now pale, dotted with cold sweat. Pride, far more than his sternum, was fractured. "Get off me, Bill," Hayes rasped, struggling to roll onto his side. He planted a massive, trembling hand on the mat and forced himself to one knee. He glared at Bruce Lee, who was conversing quietly with Captain Fletcher near the edge of the mat. "That was a parlor trick," Hayes sneered, his voice gaining volume as his breath returned. He stood up, swaying slightly before locking his knees. "A cheap, sucker-punch parlor trick. You waited until I was off balance." Fletcher spun around, exasperated. "Commander, enough. You are embarrassing yourself and the United States Marine Corps. The demonstration is over." "It's not over until I say it's over on my mat," Hayes roared, the remaining recruits flinching at the sheer volume. The commander was operating purely on adrenaline and shattered ego. To accept this defeat meant losing the absolute authority he held over his men. He needed to prove it was a fluke. From the shadowed observation balcony above the gymnasium floor, a figure leaned over the railing. General Albert Mitchell, the commanding officer of the base, had stepped out of his office to watch the visiting consultant. He said nothing, simply lighting a cigar and watching the drama unfold below. His silence was permission for the event to continue. Hayes stepped back to the center of the ring, pulling off his heavy canvas uniform jacket and throwing it aggressively to the floor, standing only in his sweat-soaked olive undershirt. No more standing still. No more demonstrations of yielding, Hayes challenged, cracking his thick neck. "You want to evaluate our combat readiness, Mr. Lee? Let's spar. Full contact. We start from 10 feet apart." Let's see your little parlor tricks when 200 pounds is rushing you." Captain Fletcher looked horrified. He turned to Lee, placing a hand on the smaller man's arm. "Mr. Lee, you have nothing to prove. General Mitchell is watching. We can walk away right now, and Hayes will face a tribunal for insubordination." Bruce Lee did not look at Fletcher. His dark eyes remained fixed on the furious behemoth across the mat. Lee understood the psychology of combat better than anyone in the room. He knew that if he walked away now, Hayes would spend the rest of his career telling his recruits that the Chinese consultant got a lucky shot and ran away out of fear. The dangerous, brute force methodology that got Marines killed in the field would persist. The lesson had to be absolute. "Captain," Lee said softly, his voice echoing with an unsettling calm, "a man who cannot accept the truth when it is handed to him must be made to swallow it." Lee handed his sunglasses back to Fletcher. He didn't bother taking off his tailored track jacket. He simply took a few steps forward, entering the center circle. He didn't adopt the rigid, square-shouldered boxing stance of the military. Instead, Lee turned his body to a sharp profile, his right side facing Hayes. His feet began to move in a light, rhythmic bounce, a footwork style he had adapted from studying fencing and the great Muhammad Ali. His lead hand extended slightly, his rear hand guarding his chin. It was the birth of Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. "Whenever you are ready, Commander," Lee invited, his hands making a quick, blurring motion. Hayes didn't hesitate. He let out a primal yell and charged. The heat inside the Camp Pendleton gymnasium suddenly felt suffocating. Commander Richard Hayes moved across the canvas with the terrifying, unchecked kinetic energy of a derailed freight train. To the 60 Marine recruits glued to the edge of the mat, the sound of his heavy combat boots slapping the floorboards was like a rapid-fire drumline, signaling absolute doom. Private Thomas Sullivan held his breath, his fingernails digging painfully into his own palms. Hayes wasn't sparring. He was executing a search-and-destroy mission. His strategy was deeply ingrained from years of brutal, close-quarters trench warfare. Close the distance immediately, absorb whatever negligible impact the smaller man's strikes might offer, wrap his massive, scarred arms around the civilian's torso, and crush the life out of him through sheer gravitational dominance. Letting out a guttural primal yell, Hayes launched a sweeping, heavy left hook. It was a haymaker designed not merely to hit, but to corral Bruce Lee, trapping him against the invisible perimeter of the sparring area where he could be broken. But Bruce Lee was no longer standing in the strike zone. The fundamental flaw in Hayes's military assault was the arrogant assumption that his target would either retreat in fear or freeze in panic. Lee did neither. As Hayes committed his center of gravity to the violent forward lunge, Lee stepped into the danger. He slid off the center line at a razor-sharp, 45-degree angle. The movement was incredibly deceptive. He didn't appear to exert any frantic effort, yet he crossed the space in a fraction of a second, his footwork practically humming with coiled tension. Before Hayes's massive left hook could travel even a third of its intended arc, Lee executed a flawless Jeet Gurk, an intercepting stop kick. It was a principle born not from brute force, but from the unforgiving geometry of combat. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. While Hayes swung a wide, looping curve that took time to travel, Lee's lead foot snapped out like a striking viper. The heel of Lee's canvas shoe drove with pinpoint, surgical accuracy into the soft tissue just above Hayes's lead knee. The impact was an ugly, wet smack that echoed up into the rafters. It wasn't designed to shatter the joint. Lee possessed entirely too much physical control for that, but it violently hyperextended the limb. A shockwave of agonizing, blinding pain rocketed up Hayes's thigh, instantly killing his forward momentum and collapsing his foundation. The 220-pound Titan groaned, his upper body pitching wildly forward as his leg buckled beneath him. Hayes was now a hostage to his own inertia. He was exactly where Lee had calculated he would be. What followed was a terrifying display of biomechanical efficiency. Lee did not load up a single cinematic knockout punch. He understood that a man of Hayes's size could potentially absorb one heavy blow. Instead, Lee unleashed a technique known as the straight blast. His hands blurred into a relentless, cyclic barrage of vertical punches, driven not just by his shoulders, but by the rapid, alternating rotation of his hips. Pop, 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 pop. The sharp, percussive cracks echoed through the Pendleton gymnasium like a string of firecrackers. 5 distinct strikes landed flush against Hayes's sternum, chin, and nose in the span of a single, agonizingly long second. The strikes were not meant to break bone. They were concussive sensory overloads. Hayes's head snapped back repeatedly, his vision swimming in a sea of white flashes. Disoriented, humiliated, and operating on pure, desperate survival instinct, the commander resorted to a lethal combat maneuver. Ignoring the unwritten rules of the sparring mat, Hayes blindly thrust his thick fingers outward in a vicious, raking gouge aimed directly at Lee's eyes. Private Sullivan gasped aloud. It was a dirty, kill or be killed tactic, meant for the battlefield, not the gymnasium. But Lee's tactile reflexes, his chisao or sticky hands, were already wired to Hayes's frantic movements. The very millisecond Hayes twitched his arm upward, Lee's left hand smoothly parried the gouging fingers outward, redirecting the lethal energy into empty air. Simultaneously, Lee pivoted his hips, dropping his weight dramatically toward the floor. He slid his right arm under Hayes's extended, vulnerable armpit, wrapping his forearm tightly behind the commander's thick neck. With a sharp, torquing twist of his torso, Lee used Hayes's own stumbling, forward weight completely against him. The leverage was absolute and mathematically perfect. Hayes's boots were literally swept from the canvas. The massive military instructor crashed back first onto the unforgiving mat with a force that rattled the wooden bleachers. The breath exploded from Hayes's lungs in a ragged, involuntary wheeze, spraying a fine mist of sweat into the air. Before the dust could even settle on the canvas, Lee had dropped to one knee. He wasn't striking, but his positioning was utterly dominant. Lee's shin pressed heavily across Hayes's bicep, pinning the larger man's right arm entirely, while Lee's perfectly clenched fist hovered precisely 1 inch above the commander's exposed windpipe. The gymnasium plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. Up on the shadowed observation balcony, General Albert Mitchell slowly lowered his cigar, his jaw tight with silent, profound revelation. The old ways of warfare had just been rendered obsolete. Lee held the lethal posture for 5 agonizing seconds. He wanted the terrifying reality of the situation to burn into the minds of every young Marine in the room. "Force against force is a battle of attrition, Commander," Lee said. His voice carried a calm, melodic resonance that sharply contrasted the extreme violence that had just occurred. "You rely entirely on your opponent being physically weaker, but muscle degrades, stamina fades. If you meet a man who is stronger, or a man holding a weapon, your brute force will betray you." Lee slowly opened his fist, his fingers relaxing. He stood up smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine charcoal track jacket. He hadn't broken a single bead of sweat. "Speed, timing, and the ability to adapt. This is how a smaller man survives a war," Lee continued, turning his dark gaze to the wide-eyed recruits sitting on the floor. His eyes locked briefly with Private Sullivan's, imparting a lesson the young man would carry for the rest of his life. "You must be shapeless, formless, like water." When you pour water in a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can drip, or it can crash. Be water, my friends. Lee turned back to the man on the floor and extended a slender hand downward. Commander Hayes lay there, his chest heaving, a thin line of blood trickling from his nostril. His pride was entirely shattered, but in its place was a newfound, undeniable respect. He stared at the civilian's hand for a long moment. Slowly, the defeated giant reached up. Bruce Lee effortlessly hoisted the massive Marine back to his feet, forever changing the doctrine of military combat in a single afternoon. That sweltering afternoon at Camp Pendleton forever altered the military's approach to hand-to-hand combat. Commander Hayes learned that sheer mass could never outmatch perfect velocity and intercepting timing. For Private Sullivan and the other recruits, the myth of the invincible giant was shattered by a slight, bespectacled civilian. Bruce Lee didn't just break a commander's pride that day. He revolutionized an entire generation's understanding of human potential.